Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Agers, and I am the director of the Institute for Child Development and Family Relations. We provide resources to parents and families in the Inland Empire region. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Leslie Amodeo, an assistant professor in the psychology department at California State University, San Bernardino, who focuses in behavioral neuroscience. She is also a local product, having graduated from Cajon High School in San Bernardino, and is also a graduate of CSUSB. Dr. Amodeo's research is on the neurobiology of adolescence and the impact drugs and alcohol have on this period of development. So with that, please welcome Dr. Leslie Amodeo.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. I hope you all had a great Thanksgiving, a great and safe Thanksgiving. And I want to thank the ICDFR for inviting me to give this talk and for all of you for showing up. So like what Mark said, I am an assistant professor at Cal State San Bernardino and within the psychology department. And my research is really looking at adolescence, but today I'm going to talk to you about early in development. So we're going to focus primarily on the first few years of life and simple ways that we can support brain development during these early years of life. So let's get started. So the first couple things that I want to talk to you about is kind of setting the stage for discussing brain development. And we have to talk about some key things like the cells that are in our brains. Specifically, we're going to talk about one type of cell called a neuron. And our brains are composed of billions of these neurons. And these neurons kind of have two components to them. The first component is going to be the cell body. And this cell body here is like every other cell body that you have. So like your skin cells, it has a nucleus, it has organelles. If you remember back to Bio 101 or your high school bio class, that might sound a little familiar. But it has a cell body like every other cell that you have. What makes these neurons or these brain cells unique is that they have something called neurons, or these little projections that come off of the cell body here. So you see these little projections that come off of this neuron here. And these neurites are really interesting because they allow for these cells to communicate. So the neurites, or these little projections that come off of the cell body, can connect with other neurons through these little junctions called synapses. And those little junctions are where those two cells can communicate. So we have cell A and cell B, so blue cell and green cell, and those two cells can communicate through these neurons. So we have billions of these brain cells called neurons, and they connect through these synapses. So if we originally were looking at two neurons, but it isn't just two neurons. So if we have billions of these neurons, all of those neurons are now going to connect. So what we end up with is a ton of this complex connection that happens within our brains. So two neurons connecting seems fairly simple. Let's say we have three connection points, so three synapses here. Once we increase that to billions and billions of neurons, now we have billions and billions of synaptic connections, which is why our brains are so complex. And our understanding of the brain is really kind of on the beginning points. So we're really starting to try to understand the brain and understand all of these billions and billions of connections. So we know really early on, during infancy and toddlerhood, that there's significant brain development happening. So we start off with about 50 billion synapses, so 50 billion connections. That number over 3 years is going to grow to 1,000 billion connections, 1,000 billion, trillion connections. So there's a significant number of synaptic connections that are going to develop over the first 3 years of life. So much so that even though the 2-year-old's brain smaller than an adult's brain, it actually has twice as many, or 50% more synaptic connections than an adult brain has. So there's a lot of these connections between these cells that are happening. So there's a lot of these synaptic connections. This image here is actually demonstrating the same idea. So we have a newborn here, and this would be, you can see the neurons, so these are the cells, the cell bodies, and we have the neurites that come off of it. You can see another cell body with the neurites coming off of it. And there's maybe a handful of these neurons in this image here, and there's not a lot of wiring. There's not a lot of those neurons. Over the first month, you can see that those neurons, that wiring is really starting to increase. And then over 3 months, you really start to see those neurites, those connections, starting to occur. And then you actually get this kind of real big bump from 3 months to 6 months that happens. And then you can see significant synaptic connections at 15 and 24 months. So by 2 years of age, you can see that there's a drastic increase in these synaptic connections happening compared to a newborn. I always show this image in my classes. I always like to point out 6 months of age. So if you have kids or your kids are grown, or if you currently have an infant, this point of 6 months of age is actually really important. And when you look at a 6-month-old, a lot of times you see, there's this change that happens with them, where they're now finally kind of sitting up, potentially sitting up. They're maybe starting to crawl. They're really starting to interact with their environment. They're really starting to engage with you at that point. And not all 6 months are at that point, but you start to see these changes happening at about half of a year. It's not surprising that we also see drastic increases in synaptic connections. So infants are now starting to interact to some degree with their environment. Their visual system is a little better. Their motor systems are getting a little better. So they're able to grab that toy at 6 months. They're able to kind of interact more with their environment, which is going to perpetuate their neural development. So it's going to increase their brain development as they interact with their environment. So it's not surprising that we see at 6 months, there's a lot of synaptic connections here. And 15 and 24 months, we've got kids that are starting to walk and really, really interact with their environment. They're able to interact on their own with their environment and do things that they probably shouldn't at that age. So you see even more kind of neural development happening between 15 and 24 months. So we've talked about the brain cells. I want to zoom out a bit, and I want to look at the brain as a whole. What's happening to the brain as a whole? We know so this image here is of a 2-week-old newborn, a 1-year-old toddler, and a 2-year-old toddler. And there's 2 terms that we're going to talk about, white matter and gray matter. And when we reference gray matter, what we're really referencing is these cell bodies. So we're talking about these cell bodies here, which is an indication of neurons. So how many neurons, how many cell bodies are there? When we talk about gray matter, we're talking about cell bodies. Further, the term gray matter actually comes from these CT scans. Do you see this gray area? That's the gray matter. That's where all of those neuronal cell bodies are. So there's neuron cell bodies. Those are all within this gray area. White matter is referencing those neurites that we talked about. So all of those connections that are being made. So this white matter, that I'll show you over here, the white matter is referencing these neurites. So these and these neurites. So all of these synaptic connections and all of that wiring is what we refer to as the white matter. And over in the CT scan here, you can see that this white area, the whiter area, is actually those synaptic connections. So all of that wiring is in this white area. So you have gray matter kind of on the outer part of the brain, and you have all of these interconnections, all of this white matter in between, and it helps to interconnect the brain so that all of these areas can communicate. And a 2-week-old, a newborn, doesn't have as much gray matter. They don't have a lot of white matter, and they're very tiny brains. Because they haven't really interacted with their world yet. They're still in this developmental stage. By 1 year of age, we see that gray matter increases 100 to 150%. There is a drastic increase in gray matter that happens over that first year of life. And this continues to develop onto the second year of life as well. White matter, on the other hand, increases about 10 to 20% over the first 2 years. It's a little more steady increase when it comes to white matter. You don't get that drastic increase in gray matter. So just comparing a 2-week-old to a 1-year-old, you can see substantial structural differences. Even 1-year-old to 2-year-old, you can see that white matter. So just looking at one little section here, just looking at this little back corner, you can see that the white matter tracks here are much more defined and much more complex than it is in this image. So there's drastic differences both in that first year of life when it comes to cell bodies. So there's an increase in neurons, as well as an increase in those synaptic connections. So lots of connections happening as that child interacts with their environment. This is another image of that, really kind of depicting those changes in gray matter and white matter. Specifically, I just want you to look at the dark pink or the dark salmon color and the light salmon color here. This is the percent change increase in gray matter and the percent change increase in white matter over the first couple of years of life. So this is from birth to about 3 years of age. You can see again that 100 to 150% increase in gray matter that seems to stabilize throughout childhood. So you have this massive increase that happens, and then it kind of stabilizes. Over at the end, you might have kind of seen a slight decrease in adolescence. We won't talk about that, but there are declines that happen that are actually really important for development as well. Additionally, we also see white matter has a steady increase that happens throughout those first 3 years of life. So steady increase in those synaptic connections and all of that wiring that happens that continues to occur into adolescence. So that wiring is really important for kind of complex function. So decision making, learning, all of those aspects that we get better at as we grow and develop. So that white matter is really important for those processes. So I talked a lot about increasing. I talked a lot about how the brain is really kind of growing and getting bigger. But that isn't the whole story. It isn't that we just continue to pile on the synapses. We don't continue to increase in wiring and increase in synaptic connections. What ends up happening in toddlerhood is that we start to fine-tune these connections as well. So it isn't just continuing to increase throughout our development, but there's actually this process of fine-tuning these connections. So for example, let's say that there's 5 different ways to tie your shoes. Okay? So you're learning how to tie your shoes, and there's potentially 5 different ways to tie your shoes. There's one way where there's only one bunny hoop. There's another way where you make 2 bunny hoops, but then you kind of tie them together. You know, the first way you learn how to tie your shoes. There's another way that we typically tie our shoes where you take the bunny around the tree and then it drops into the rabbit hole. And I'm teaching my 7-year-old how to tie her shoes. So this is the example I have today. And then you have another example where you're just tying it and you don't use the little bunny hoops. You just tie it and it's done. And it's a double knot. Okay, so let's say there's 5 different ways to tie your shoe. It doesn't make sense to continue to tie your shoes 5 different ways, right? So when you're learning, you may kind of shift between these different options. But as you really start to learn how to tie your shoes, you start to only tie it in a couple different ways, and then finally really tie it in one specific way. Okay, so initially you tied it 5 different ways. Now you're only tying it one way. And you chose this way because it's the fastest and the most economical. Okay. So this type of tying your shoes really gets strengthened to the point where you don't even think about how you tie your shoes. You just tie them. Okay? So you're really quick, really fast, and this is the connection that you've made. This is the type of shoe tying that you do. So this concept also works with synaptic connections. We have 5 different synaptic connections. So a toddler is exposed to an environment. And they're learning how to, let's say, kick a ball for the first time. There might be a lot of different synaptic connections. But as they get better and better at it, certain synaptic connections are going to strengthen so that they get better and faster at kicking that ball. So this idea of synaptic pruning and pruning away all of these other connections and strengthening only those connections that are important is really important for speed, as well as being able to do things is also important for development as well. So you're able to do things a lot faster, a lot quicker. You can kick that ball. You can also engage in other activities because you're faster at kicking that ball. You can start to play with other kids while kicking that ball. So this idea of synaptic pruning is incredibly important. And really involves sensory stimulation and interaction with the environment. One of the classic examples of this is pruning a rose bush. So if you have a rose bush, what you end up doing is those branches that aren't as strong, you end up pruning away, so that the strong branches end up receiving the most nutrients, as well as end up strengthening those strongest branches. And this is important because then you produce more flowers. You're able to produce more roses when you're able to strengthen the branches that are most important. They are the strongest branches, and prune away the ones that aren't. So now to our question. We talked a little bit about background. How can parents actually ensure healthy brain growth in their children? And there's a lot of different ways we could phrase this. There's a lot of different things we could talk about. We could talk about reducing exposure to drugs. We could talk about not exposing our children to secondhand smoke. We could talk about increasing exercise. So letting them go outside and play. Just exercise alone has been shown to really help areas like the hippocampus of the brain. The hippocampus is an area of the brain that's important for learning and memory. So just going outside and exercising is incredibly important. Things like nutrients, getting the proper nutrients, providing kids fruits and vegetables, talking with kids, having that interaction, physical touch, hugging, sensory play and reading, giving your kids enough sleep at night. So having them go to bed and making sure that they get the acceptable amount of sleep. There's some pretty cool work when it comes to naps in 2 and 3-year-olds, where they show that if kids get naps, so when they typically take naps, if they get those naps, they actually recall certain tasks better later on. But if you prevent them from taking those naps, they actually don't do as well in the afternoons. So there's a lot of research kind of showing the benefits of napping and getting the appropriate amount of sleep. As well as providing them with a safe environment. So down here with the school bus, I haven't seen a school bus in months, but providing them with a safe environment is also important for ensuring healthy brain growth. For this talk, I'm actually just going to focus on 3 things. I'm going to focus on hugs, so physical touch, talking or communicating. And when we say talking, we're not just I'm not just talking about the TV being on and a child hearing words. When we say that someone's talking or communicating with a child, that engagement of back and forth is incredibly important. So that child being able to express themselves and then the parent understand and respond to what that child has said. That's what I'm referring to when it comes to talking. And then sensory play. And sensory play it seems like it has to be multicolored spaghetti that takes hours to make. I've never actually gone to the point of making it, but I've seen it being made and it takes a bit. But it doesn't have to be multicolored spaghetti. It could be a bowl of water outside, and a child being able to take their toys outside and play in that water. So just simple water play is sensory play as well. So it doesn't have to be a very complex thing. So we're going to talk about these three things. And we're going to begin with attachment or hugs, and really looking at this idea of simple touch. One thing before we move on, I want to explain that when it comes to developmental research, a lot of this research is done in preclinical models, meaning that it's done in animal models, like what you can see up here on the left-hand side, which is a rat. The reason why a lot of these studies are done in preclinical models is because it can be difficult to work with. Well, one aspect is it can be very difficult to work with kids. And even a CT scan, like the CT scans I showed you before, those kids have to stay incredibly still. So with those CT scans, a lot of times they have to sedate. So there aren't a lot of brain studies in kids because it can be very, very difficult to work with them. And I mean, even adults, it's hard to get them to sit still for an hour. So it's not surprising that you can't get a toddler to sit for an hour. So a lot of these studies, just differences between kids and adults. It's very difficult to do a lot of these brain studies. Additionally, we can't, take away nurturing in an infant and see how it changes their development. We can't manipulate children so that we can look at long-term changes. But we can ask a lot of these questions in preclinical models. So we can ask these questions of, are these drugs of abuse impacting development? And we can ask those questions in preclinical models, whereas it would be very difficult to experimentally ask those questions in a newborn. So that's why you'll see that a lot of the research is kind of built on preclinical models. So I'll show you a couple of these studies. And I'll also show you the more recent human research that's been done to try to look at, well, does this translate? Does the animal models translate to humans? So the first study I'm going to show you was looking at simple touch. So this study was initially done in an animal model, so in a rat. And you can see that the paradigm of the study was that they massaged or pet the rat during early development. And what they found is that if they pet the rat during early development, when they were pups, it had a significant impact on their visual system. So completely different systems. We have our touch system and our visual system. And just massaging that rat pup, had a significant impact on the visual system. This was replicated in humans as well. So they took newborns and they massaged the newborns back. They rubbed the newborns back. And what they found is that at 3 months, those newborns had better visual acuity, better developed visual system than those newborns that didn't receive this additional treatment, so the additional massage. So something as simple as touch can have a big impact on other sensory systems as well. It didn't just impact touch systems, but it impacted visual systems. So this is a very classic study. As you could tell, the picture's in black and white. It's a very classic, and there's little bumpers. There's little bumpers here, which I don't think we're allowed to use anymore. But this is a very classic study that's showing that simple massage can have an impact on development of sensory systems real early on in newborns. Further, there are also studies really looking at this idea of maternal nurturing and how it impacts how the baby handles stress as an adult. And I'll initially show you preclinical, and then I'll show you clinical studies. But what this research is based on is this idea where they've taken mother rats and they've looked at high nurturing mother rats and low nurturing mother rats. And we consider someone high nurturing when that mother rat is sitting on her pups and nursing her pups and cleaning her pups and creating a nest. So doing all of these things to support those pups. So that's considered a high nurturing mother. A low nurturing mother would be one that doesn't nurse her pups as often, that doesn't clean them as well, that tends to have other things to do besides sit on her pups and nurse. So there's kind of these two different types of mothers, so high nurturing and low nurturing mothers. And what they found is that those mothers that interacted with their pups more, that had more kind of physical interaction with their pups, they ended up being able to handle stress better later on in life. Furthermore, it actually changed their stress systems. So these pups, as adults, actually had more of something called cortisol receptors. These are things that detect cortisol. Cortisol is important for stress. So it changed the number of cortisol receptors, increased the number of cortisol receptors in the hippocampus, so that these offspring had a better ability to handle stress as an adult. So this was a really interesting study, and it's been looked at in humans as well. And there's two here. The first study was looking at when not at high nurturing versus normal, but looking at low nurturing. So looking at children that were abused and then as adults committed suicide. So there's two suicide groups here. So we have a control group, which was not suicide. We have a suicide group here and a suicide group here. This suicide group, this group of individuals were not abused as children. This group of individuals were abused as children. And what they found is that compared to both controls and non-abused individuals who committed suicide, there was actually a decrease in these cortex hippocampus, just like what we showed with, or that has been shown with low nurturing mothers. So low nurturing mothers resulted in those rat pups having a low number of receptors. So a low number of cortisol receptors, which led to more anxiety in adulthood. We also see here that those who have had a history of child abuse also had low levels of those cortisol receptors in the hippocampus, which is, again, an indication that their ability to handle stress as an adult might not have been as good as those that hadn't been abused as children or compared to the controls. Further, there were studies done in live people, not postmortem, but there were studies done, developmental studies done, looking at the level of maternal care in humans and associating that with changes in gene expression. So this is a concept of epigenetics. I'm not going to go into it, but basically they found the same thing. They found that maternal care increased the number of cortisol receptors, or increased a indication that there would be an increase in cortisol receptors. So we can't directly look at it, but we can indirectly look at increases and decreases in these cortisol receptors. And what they found is with increased maternal care, there was an increase in these cortisol receptors. So those children had a better ability to handle stress later on. They also looked in those infants, whether they were able to handle stress as infants, if there were differences in the ability for them to handle stress. And they did this through a task down here at the bottom, where the mother kind of interacted with the child, sat there and interacted with the child and smiled and played with them here in A and B. And then the second condition to that trial was where she didn't interact with them. So it was a flat face, flat affect. So she didn't respond when the child smiled or giggled or made noises. She kind of flat faced it. And typically in kids, that causes a lot of distress. So kids don't like it when you don't interact with them. So being flat faced, it causes stress in those kids. Those that had high maternal care actually handled that situation better than kids that didn't have that same kind of high maternal care. So again, when we talk about maternal care, we're just talking about interacting. We're just talking about hugging kids and playing with them and smiling at them and snuggling on the couch. We're not talking about anything complicated. So when it comes to attachment, we know that attachment can have a significant impact on how that child can handle stress later on in life. It can significantly impact their brains, but also future behaviors as well, and future ability to handle stress. Something that stress that we're all going through right now. So the next concept that we're going to talk about is going to be communication. And language is known to be one of the most important predictors of success later in life. There's been studies showing that the more you talk to a child, the better off they're going to be. So children who have more turn-taking conversations were better at language comprehension tasks. And again, when we talk about communication, we're not talking about one-sided communication. We're talking about getting down on their level and really talking back and forth with that child, really having that conversation. And even though they can't really have that conversation at 6 months or a year of age, they're starting to learn that turn-taking ability. They may make cooing noises or little noises, and you respond by talking with them about it and making up your own conversations. So that initial kind of conversation turn-taking is incredibly important and can really enhance their language comprehension skills. Children also have stronger white matter connections. Remember our synaptic connections. They have stronger white matter connections, important for language, with positive correlations between activation and time spent in conversation. So the more you talk with them, the more active the brain is going to be. And you can see here that kids, this is an area of the brain, the frontal cortex, the frontal cortex, so part of the brain here, is strongly correlated. There's more activity the more you talk with the child, the more conversation that you have. And this is irrespective of socioeconomic status. So one of these over here is socioeconomic status. You still see that area lighting up and correlating with conversations. It's irrespective of language or the type of communication or the depth of that communication. So communication is incredibly important. Having those conversations is incredibly important for child development. And specifically, quality is better than quantity. So turning on the TV isn't going to do it the same way as sitting down with that child and talking with them and getting down to their level. Higher income parents use longer sentences and more vocabulary than lower income parents. So there's something called a word gap that's been shown, where those of lower income, children of lower income, their verbal skills aren't as great as those of higher income. And one of the differences they've seen between lower and higher income is the quality of the sentences. So the longer sentences, the increase in vocabulary that those parents have. So in, really having those longer sentences and those vocabulary is really important for facilitating that child's development. So baby talk is not good. Really talking with them and having those conversations is Low-income kids who took part in more conversations at 2 years actually had more advanced language at 1 year later. So it isn't just low-income versus high-income. If you talk with those parents and tell them, have more of these conversations with your child, what they showed is that if you have more conversations with those children, this can actually advance their language a year later. So it can have a significant impact on the language. Irrespective of their income, it can really have an impact on their language. And then the last thing that we're going to talk about is going to be sensory play. And sensory play stimulates children's senses, which is fundamental for perception and cognition. So when we say perception and cognition, we're saying that child's hand-eye coordination, their perception of where things are in space in reference to who they are, as well as their cognition, which is how they process things, how they learn, what they think, and the depth of their kind of decision making. It kind of explaining why they did things. So it's really interacting and having an enriched environment is really important for a lot of different aspects of perception and cognition. So sensory development has certain optimal windows, and they tend to be in the first years of life. So being exposed to things, sensory things, is really important in those first few years of life. There are studies showing that in children with cataracts, if they have cataracts and they don't get it treated within the first couple months, it can actually cause long-term impairments in the visual system. There's situations of Romanian orphanages where there's severe deprivation that happens to kids, or there's kind of historical situations where these have happened to kids, and it can lead to smaller total brain volume in those kids. So that severe deprivation really early on has a significant impact and a long-term impact on development. And this leads to both intellectual and attentional deficits. And so this idea of exposing a child to different senses is important for their development. Different environments is really important. And it isn't just one environment. It isn't just touching spaghetti. It's all about multiple different sensory systems kind of coming together. It's about smelling that Play-Doh. A lot of kids like to smell it, or tasting Play-Doh, or playing textile with the Play-Doh and the spaghetti. It's really integrating all of these different senses and using their motor systems to integrate with those senses. Doing that, just playing with Play-Doh. You're interacting and doing all these different kind of sensory systems, as well as motor systems. Give them a fork to play with in it. And it's going to enhance these sensory systems and integrate all of those systems within their brain. You're creating all of those synaptic connections within the brain by letting that child interact with new things. This was one example that I really liked. It doesn't reference the brain, but I think it's really a nice example of showing multisensory play and it impacting other elements. So what they found with this study is that multisensory play using fruits and vegetables, so they handed the kids a box full of vegetables and let them play with it. So let them squish up the bananas and let them, smell the different types of fruits and, touch everything. So they let them do everything but actually taste the food. So they let them play with all of these different fruits and vegetables. And then they actually found that these preschool-aged kids were more likely to try these foods because they had engaged all of these different sensory systems when it came to play with those foods. So letting your kids play with their foods is sensory play, but it also can increase potentially increase or encourage the variety of foods that child is willing to try. And this can have further implications on nutritional choices. So that child, because they interacted with a lot of different new things. They may be willing to try new foods, which kind of broadens from chicken nuggets and applesauce. So it might broaden their or encourage the variety of foods that they eat, which can also have a significant impact on brain development. So that's it. That's all I have. Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat, or if you want to contact me later, I can provide you with that information. I'd like to thank the ICDFR for organizing these web seminars. And their information is over on the right. They usually have a bunch of these web seminars, so please register for the other ones as well, because they should be really interesting. Thank you again, and I'm going to turn it back over to Mark.
Wonderful. Leslie, thanks so much. That was such an informative webinar. And, we talk so much about these things we know about healthy child development and healthy families. It's nice to see it so integrated with the science, right? So that we understand that this is coming from, a really sound place, right? And a lot of hard work that good people do to learn about these things. So I really appreciate you tying those things together. We do have a number of questions, and so I'd like to use the remaining time just to kind of go through some of those. And if you have a question but you haven't yet sent one, feel free to use the chat feature, and I will pick up on it there. But we got a couple of questions around like tools, toys, apps, the kinds of things that you see advertised a lot that are sort of pitched as these are important for brain development in babies. But so we had one question that asked, where is it? Here it is. How important are these sort of baby brain toys? They refer to them. And then someone else asked, there are so many online applications that advertise learning for kids. Are these things supported by research? And are these the kinds of things that parents should be thinking about for their kids?
So I was going to say I have 3 kids. So I have 3 girls. The oldest is 7, so I've seen a lot of these ads. When it comes down to it, yes, those toys. So you get the fancy multicolored toys, or for babies, you have the black and white toys. Yes, those are going to be stimulating. And if you spend hundreds of dollars on those toys, yes, they're going to be stimulating. But you could also just give them the box, and they would be happy, and that's stimulating too. So if you have the finances to pay for the toys, they're going to have a lot of toys. But there's also very simple things that you can do that are also stimulating. Things like PlayDoh. So I actually, I'll give the PowerPoint to Mark, but this is a link for making your own PlayDoh. So just making PlayDoh and letting them play with PlayDoh and giving them a spoon and a fork with that PlayDoh so that they can cut up the Play-Doh and play with that. A water table, and not even a water table, just a bucket of water outside, a bucket of sand outside is stimulating. So yes, those toys, they've potentially done experimental studies looking at not giving them toys versus giving them those toys. And yeah, they're going to be stimulating, but there's also a lot of cheaper things that are also stimulating as well. So I don't think it's always, buying them the most expensive toy. And I've seen recently with the holidays coming up, there's toys out there that talk about, there's one new little toy where it talks back and forth with your child. So it learns if your child is sad, and then asks it questions, or it asks that child, talk with it. And again, it's not going to do the same as your interaction with your child. Yes, that's better than a toy that doesn't interact, but also you physically interacting with your child is going to be the best situation. And it's that back and forth conversation. It's increasing their vocabulary. The longer sentences are learning grammar to hearing you talk. So it's that physical interaction. It's hugging your child. That robot's not going to hug your child. It's those simple things that you can do that are really going to make the biggest difference.
That's great. That's really helpful. And I kind of noticed that too in some of the examples you were giving throughout your presentation. These were always things that, just as being a parent, being present, you can engage in these activities and and interactions with your child, they don't necessarily require extra resources, expensive gadgets to have that impact that you're talking about.
And just one more thing on that. There's some studies out there showing like bilingual kids, when they're trying to teach them a second language, if they set them in front of a TV and try to teach them a second language, they don't learn as well as if they actually interact with another person. So there is a difference between TV and another person.
Sure.
Especially with learning language.
That's really powerful. Thank you. We had another question that someone asked about missing opportunities. So in other words, they ask if you kind of miss opportunities for, your baby's brain growth at year one, can you make up for that when they're 2 or when they're 3 or older?
Yeah, definitely. Again, the first couple of years of life, we see massive development happening. And there's studies showing that even at, the Romanian orphanage studies have shown that kids that have been in severe deprivation for the first 2 years of life, if they're pulled out of that situation and put into a family, they can do significantly better. So just being placed into a nurturing environment can have a significant impact. And that's not as a newborn. That's after 2 years of development. This child is walking and talking and interacting with their environment. So even after 2 years, placing them in a nurturing environment is going to have a significant impact in brain development. And one thing that I kind of pointed out, but those curves didn't change. The white matter continues to increase throughout adolescence. So there isn't a point of saying, oh, well, they're 3, they're done, they're developed. No,
right.
We're developing all the way into young adulthood. So impacting it at any point is going to help that child's development.
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, and I have an 8 and 11-year-old, right? And I have that question, like, did I do it wrong? Am I too late? Can I go back? So that's, it's helpful to hear that, right? It's reassuring for sure. One, sort of straightforward, but I think question that probably a lot of folks have. Do you have like specific recommendations for first-time parents, right? Like if you had some top tips for first-time parents to help their child's brain development, what would they be?
It would probably be just don't stress yourself out. A lot of times when it comes to first-time parents, they stress about everything. And that stress isn't going to help that child. That child's going to feed off of that stress. So one thing, I talked a little bit about stress, but when it comes to raising kids, you're doing it just fine. Talk with your kids, do simple things, interact with them. That's the most important thing. Don't stress about getting them the new cool toy. Because when it comes down to it, you talking with them, you interacting with them, snuggling on the couch, that's going to make the biggest difference.
Someone else asked, really interesting. I love getting the questions from the community. They're so interesting, right? Someone asked, do fathers influence babies' development, in the same ways that mothers do?
Yes, yeah. So there is a really cool, if you get a chance, YouTube has it now, so you don't even have to have Netflix. But there is a really cool documentary called Babies on Netflix. And it really points out, there's this really neat study, and it shows a gay couple and how their brains are different than, it basically is talking about how fathers, if they take on the rules, their brains will develop in certain ways. And it actually increases areas of the brain important for emotions and things like that. So even fathers interacting with their babies can change not just babies' development, because now they have 2 supporting parents and 2 parents that are able to environmentally stimulate them. But it also changes the father's brain as well. So it changes kind of certain areas of his brain as well. So there's significant on both ends, both mothers and fathers. That documentary shows a couple, and it really demonstrates that it doesn't matter your gender; it matters whether you're a caregiver or not.
Another person asked about their 2-year-old child's autism, right? And that was one of the things I was thinking about as you were kind of presenting your material, the extent to which you sort of talk about typically developing brains and patterns and whatnot, and if those are different for children, say children with autism.
Yeah, so all of these things can be applied to kids with autism. The issue is that kids with autism tend to have either hypo or hypersensitivities. So things that you can't just put out a bowl full of spaghetti and expect that child to interact with it. So the types of sensory interaction might be slightly different. They may be a little slower to interact with certain sensories, textile, play, and things like that. But all of these things can also be applied to kids with developmental disabilities as well. There was some interesting work really showing that by doing sensory play, you're also giving them ways to cope with their anxiety. So you can, by engaging them in certain sensory play, they may learn kind of other techniques to cope with anxiety. So you're going to lessen anxiety by exposing them to those new kind of sensory information, but also it may provide them with certain coping mechanisms. So instead of hand flapping, they may rub a pencil instead. So they may learn to rub a pencil instead. So they're able to kind of engage in social interaction a little better because they're not hand flapping, which is one common thing we see with autism. So by engaging them in different sensory play, they may develop other coping mechanisms.
Someone else asked, how important is interaction or play dates with other kids in the first 3 years for healthy development?
So social play is important. When it comes to that early age, and this might have been talked about in another webinar, but when it comes to early age, kids are parallel play, really. They start to develop some kind of interactions in social play. But if we're talking about COVID right now, I wouldn't stress about it. In the next year, they're going to go to preschool. They're going to interact with other kids. There's going to be more of that. This isn't going to, by any means, stunt their growth because they're at home playing with you and talking with you. If anything, that's going to increase their vocab. It's going to increase their verbal skills. You're going to have more sensory play than just having them play with little kids. So in some cases, this might be better for their development. I'm not saying that COVID's better, but, they're going to get to interact with you more. That social interaction is going to come, and they're going to pick it up very quickly.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, right? I mean, I experience that as well. I'm home a lot more now, right? That's like many of us because of COVID. And that's been challenging in many ways. But there's no question I'm spending more quality time with my children than I had been before. And that has benefits, right? Leslie, this has been terrific. I appreciate your talk. I appreciate all the information that you shared. One last thing that was actually, it came in the questions, but I'm wondering if you might have an answer now, but also if we could, when we upload the video, maybe include some other ideas. Folks asked, is there particular literature or books that folks could read to learn more, that you would recommend to learn more about brain development in babies and toddlers? And what I would ask is, maybe you have a recommendation now or not, but if you don't, and even if you do you think you could get us a couple of links and we could put them up for folks when we post the video?
Yeah, definitely. I'll just provide you with some links. I do recommend that babies documentary. I saw it in the chat. I do recommend that. It's actually really fun to watch. And what I love about it is that it shows the labs, it shows the research. It's actually the researchers describing their studies that they've done. So it really is kind of going to the source when it comes to that documentary, and it's available on YouTube. So you don't have to have Netflix.
Wonderful.
Which is a plus.
Right.
But yeah, I'll get you some more links as well, some more information.
Wonderful. Well, wonderful. We would. I know I would appreciate that, and I know the folks listening would appreciate that as well. All right. Well, with that, Leslie, I want to say thank you so much for spending your time with us today, sharing your expertise, both about research, but also about, practical things that people can think about and do in their own families with their own children. It means a lot. Thank you so much for your time.
No problem. Thank you.
And to everyone who was in our audience today, I want to thank you for participating in this webinar hosted by the Institute for Child Development and Family Relations at California State University, San Bernardino. The ICDFR has been providing guidance for parents and families based on science and best practice since 2002. Have a wonderful day and be well.